All right, you should be live now.
All right, Mary, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you everyone for your patience and harmony, and Karen for working that out. Thanks. Great. So we have done introductions, but maybe we should just do it for the record here. I'm Mary Hutchins, the chair of the board here.
Jessica Connor, psychologist at Northeast Pediatrics.
Hi, Dorothy Lovelace, new board member, most recently at the county, but now at Cornell University.
Elise Schweitzer, Vice President of the board.
Veronica Pillar, they, them, county legislature member, not on the board.
Sally McConnell, Janae, new member.
Paula Winter, mental health board member.
Jan Lynch, member of the board. Sheila McHenry, member of the board.
Harmony Ayers Friedlander, Deputy Commissioner.
Great. And those of you, wherever you are, do you want to introduce yourselves? You do have labels.
Larry Roberts, member of the board.
Tom Leipa, member of the board.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Frank Krupa, and I am the Public Health Director and Commissioner. And Mary, it does appear you have a quorum in the room.
It does. That's great. Good. All right. Well, going on the agenda here, any additions to the agenda? I did just want to add an executive session at the end. So that's one change. Anything else anyone wants to mention? Okay. So let's go on to the approving the minutes from October. I have a motion to approve them, Sheila. Okay, a second. Paula, any discussion about them? Jan? There's the second page.
When we went into executive session at the end, it says the vote in executive session was to confirm the appointment of Dorothy. Was that done in executive session?
Outside of
No, yeah, it should be outside, I believe.
I can have a hard time remembering. So we come out of executive session and then we vote. The
Right,
executive session is to discuss the candidate.
correct. Yeah.
So that was the only thing I saw.
Okay.
I wasn't even sure it was.
Need anything else? So with that correction, all in favor of accepting the October minutes?
Aye.
Great. All right, thank you. Any privilege of the floor? Any board announcements or correspondence? So going on to my report. I think Frank is going to talk a little bit about the bylaws and the term limit updates. But I did just want to thank everyone for your input in the letter that we sent to the legislature, and I know Jan and Larry and Sheila were able to attend some of the meetings. So I think that was really helpful to have it clear what our concerns were and what the implications are for those proposed changes at this point. So thanks everyone for that.
And thank you, Mary, for reading the letter on our behalf at the legislative meeting.
Great.
Writing it.
Yeah.
Well,
Good. So we'll hear more about where that stands, but I don't have any other updates at this time. So I'll pass it on to you, Frank.
Sure. Thanks, Mary. My apologies for not being there. I forgot that I would be away at a conference for this meeting, and actually my list of things to update you all on is on my desk there. So I'll do my best to remember, starting with the update Mary was just referencing. I don't have a lot of update other than to say that the policy that the legislature is looking to potentially adopt is still going through the policy review process. My understanding was there was feedback from department heads that needed to be reviewed and incorporated or not. And then it would require another kind of flow through department heads for feedback. So we're probably a little bit further into the future on a final vote on that particular policy, probably taking us into the new year. I think the legislature heard clearly that if they were going to do this, doing it in November or December and making it immediately effective would create some challenges. So I think these delays are actually going to result in addressing at least that problem. As far as the term limits piece, I don't have any inside information on where the legislature stands on that, other than to know that it's still in the review and deliberation process. So, we'll all be kind of waiting to see what, what comes out in the next draft that gets brought forward for them to vote on. The other update is that at their last meeting, the legislature voted unanimously to amend the county charter to essentially create the single department. So that is the kind of the final official step that they needed to take. So we are now officially the Tompkins County Whole Health Department rather than two separate departments. We are working internally on a communications plan with kind of a ramp up, kind of a coming soon in December approach, with January, starting the new year as our new self plan for that. So there'll be more information coming around that and our launch of the new name to the public. So a good bit of excitement coming around that. We do have an all staff meeting scheduled for December 8th. So we'll be bringing everybody together again to kind of replicate I don't know if replicate's the right word, but to do something similar to what we did in December 2019, when the legislature voted then to merge the departments and give us 18 months to make that happen. Obviously, things got stalled by COVID, but we wanted to have another opportunity to do that with the staff. So we're working on a robust agenda for the day with folks. Both departments will be close to the public, so everyone can participate. So a good bit of excitement building for all of this. So those were the two big updates that I had related to the legislature. Harmony and or Mary, was there other things that I was supposed to cover?
Not thinking of anything more.
Okay.
I think though, as we hear that the term limit issue is going to be on different committee agendas, I think it'd be helpful for us to be aware of that if we wanted to comment. Jan?
Well, I was going to go to the second meeting that you had mentioned. I believe it was you, Frank, that mentioned it, and it went around in an email. And when I tried to sign up to make a comment, Brittany said I was in the wrong group and I needed to go to the government operations group. So I went to that meeting and all they were talking about was legislature term limits. And so there was nothing really that relevant to advisory boards. The only thing that was said pretty clearly by some of them was, if we're going to have advisory board term limits, then we should have legislator term limits. But so it would be helpful to get to the right meeting.
Yeah, my apologies if you ended up in the wrong place. Government operations is the committee that would be considering the resolution, and we can make sure that you guys are aware. The last time that I looked at it, when we were talking about this, there wasn't anything on the agenda about this particular issue. So my apologies if there was some confusion.
It was interesting anyways.
All right. I'll definitely make sure. I'll go look right now and see when the next GO meeting is so I can let you guys know that. Otherwise, I don't have anything else, Mary, unless folks have questions.
Any questions?
But I just asked a question. Is there a definite proposal out there on the term limits question?
No, I don't there was conversation and there was draft language that talked about 2 terms that were being considered, but my understanding is that is being reviewed further and that there's likely to be a different version. I don't know what that is or where that language stands at the moment, but as soon as I hear something, I'll definitely let you all know.
They're not aware for what it's worth, although I should say, like, I'm not on the Government Operations Committee or the ad hoc subcommittee that's been working on it, but I haven't heard anything more recently than you have.
Okay. All right. Well, sounds like we'll stay up on this and see what opportunities we have to help express our feelings and concerns about this. So good. Great. Well, the majority of our meeting is going to focus on the outcome of a discussion we had at the Mental Health Subcommittee and what Larry had arranged for some speakers to come to the Mental Health Subcommittee talking about the issues regarding the encampments in the community. We thought it would be useful for Jan and Larry to talk about what we heard during that meeting, just to make sure that the whole board is informed about these concerns. We're really focusing on it because the folks that we are charged with supporting and advocating for are disproportionately represented in the encampments in the community. So it certainly is under our umbrella of concerns. So the plan is we'll hear from Jan and Larry, so you all have the same information that we heard. And then Frank is going to talk a little bit about what initiatives and planning has happened in the county to address some of these concerns. And I'm hoping that at the end, maybe we'll come to some conclusion about what we might want to do as a board with this issue. So that's how we're planning on proceeding here. So I guess does that sound okay, Larry?
Yeah, Jan, do you want to go first or do you want me to?
It doesn't matter to me.
Why don't you go first and then I'll fill in because you had a pretty
Yeah, I have my list that I think everyone saw. So Chris Titelbaum, or is it Teitelbaum? I think Baum. Anyways, Chris from the what is the
Is it
the Friendship? Yeah, St. John. I'm gonna call it the Friendship Center. He's the person who did a lot of the talking about this. And it was really concerning to listen to the different points he made. And he gave an estimate that was pretty high percentage-wise of how many people there had some type of disability, whether it was substance use, some sort of intellectual or developmental disability or mental health disabilities. So I think that's what caught my attention, is just that I hadn't really, I mean, I knew that to a certain extent, but didn't he say like 80% or something like that?
Yeah, he said the majority of people who are living in the encampment probably have some kind of mental health and or other kind of disability related diagnosis, and many of them have what we would see and probably officially have diagnoses of serious mental illness. But he also pointed out, and I think most people would agree, that the state of being houseless and homeless and living outdoors will cause all kinds of stress and may bring on, mental health problems anyway. So it's a major issue, to say nothing of the drug use, substance use diagnoses, which he seemed to indicate were also very common among the people who live in the encampments.
I think I sent, I guess I didn't send this to everyone on the board. I guess it was just a group that we were talking a little bit about it. But some of the points I made was that the majority of the people living in encampments have some type of disability. Many people living unhoused would not choose to live in a planned encampment like Tides. I don't know if you've heard of Tides, but it's the development they're trying to get through that would build several sort of like campsites for people. So that's, to me, that's a little disturbing considering they said it would cost $1 million to build it and then $600,000 a year to staff it. And I just think that, not that my opinion's the be all and end all of this, but that seems like a lot of money for a problem that is so complex. It may only serve a small amount of the people, but at any rate, the other thing that's a big deal is that at any given time, Ithaca has only a few affordable housing opportunities. So if there's 100 people in the encampment and they get maybe 2 of them to the point where they can go into housing, there sometimes isn't any, or there may only be 2 opportunities at any given time. So there's never enough housing, even if they could get people. And then the next problem is when people get into it, they often end up evicted or kicked out or whatever, because they don't really have the skills at that point to really live in an, not outside and have the independent living skills that would match what we expect when somebody lives in an apartment. So they would need really intensive support to relearn some of those community living skills and so on. So that's another kind of tripping. Yeah, so, and most of the unhoused community find the appointments and paperwork involved in getting financial or other types of help just too much to bother with. They won't even, try to do it because it just feels so disconnected. There's, they fill out one form and that's only good for one thing, or they can't even finish filling it out. And some things are dependent, of course, on having a permanent address. So that's another issue. They have a lot of people there, or a fair amount of people there, who are involved in illegal activities. There's meth labs, human trafficking. They're burning down other areas and disputes. There's different, groups of people there that if they don't like what one group does, they'll go and burn down their area. And there have been a lot of fires there. And so they're preying on people who are just trying to manage themselves there too. So that's a huge concern. As well as the nearby neighborhoods and businesses feel like they're kind of victimized too, because they're no longer safe. Like in Nate's Floral Estates, there was a story about one woman who had kept buying her kids bikes because, she wanted her kids to have bikes and they kept getting stolen. And after 8 bikes, she just stopped buying them because I guess it wasn't worth it, which makes sense. And also the businesses are really concerned. And the other thing is that there's a lot of pressure for development plans near the encampments. That whole area is supposed to be some really nice community thing that is planned by some architectural firm, I believe, or something. But anyways, the other thing is that the hotel that houses a lot of the people when Code Blue is in effect is in the process of being sold to someone else. And so there's uncertainty there if this new owner will want to do the Code Blue people housing them there. So he said that's probably going to happen in about a year when it's complete. And that's when we might see the results of that. So I don't think it was this winter that the way he spoke, but it was just so obvious to me that it was just such a complex problem with so many. I mean, it's kind of like I don't know, there's just so many different aspects of it that people need help with. And there's not going to be one single thing that's going to do it, like the Tides encampment. And the Tides encampment people who propose that even say that, but their line that they usually say is, don't throw away the good looking for the perfect, which I think is a good insight, but I don't necessarily think I think we should look really closely if it's that much money. Is there a way it could be dispersed to serve more people possibly than putting up buildings and having a designated encampment? But, you know, my opinion isn't the only opinion, so I'm trying to keep that out of it. It was just very disturbing. And I don't know how many people are on Facebook, but there's a couple different sites where they went to clean it up a couple weeks ago, and it was just amazing to me how bad it was. I mean, the ground was just covered with hypodermic, you know, the plastic disposable needles, and there were areas where there were just like probably 20 of the propane tanks, and that's what often starts the fires, I guess. And it was really sad, and it was really disappointing to see that it had gotten to that point. I guess I hadn't realized, even though I've heard about it, I think seeing it and hearing him talk, the two things together, I really found very disturbing that there's just not a community-wide effort to do something about it. Although, as I understand it, both the city and the county are looking at $100,000 each in their budgets to put towards trying to work on that. So, Barry, if you want to add anything, or if you do, Mary,
Sure.
at the meeting.
Sure. So I think it's two things I think are important for people to know right now. There's been some form of encampment in the general area that we usually think of as the jungle for about 100 years. So this is not a new problem, and this is not a new way that people have figured out how to survive in our community.
But it's a much larger number than it's ever been.
But it's right, exactly. I was going to say that, but it's expanded, and now it's impinging particularly on Nate's Floral Estates and some of the businesses on Cherry Street to an extent that it hadn't before. My concern is, in my head, I had sort of assumed that the Tides working group would stay together and shepherd the proposal through whatever phases it was going through, and that as part of that, the legislature and the Common Council would continue to work on and hear from advocates about the need to do a variety of things to address people who live or stay at the encampment. But that's not the case. And so my concern is, I think there needs, and I think this is true of the subcommittee, I think there needs to be a group of people who are continuing to remind the legislature and continuing to remind Common Council and making recommendations to Common Council and to the legislature about what would work and what we want to see happening at the encampment, and for people who are houseless and homeless in general, because while the encampment is a large part of how people deal with homelessness, there's other there are other ways that people deal with homelessness that is problematic as well. I will say the last several years, particularly with the coming of COVID, I think the varieties of human service agencies have been paying attention and making more contact with people in the encampments than I'd ever known. So, Reach has people who work with people in the encampments. Our Tompkins County Mental Health Department has people who are regularly there, Family and Children's through its outreach workers. So there's a lot of attention being paid, but what there doesn't appear to be at the moment is a group of people who are making sure that things are moving along, and not that the legislature isn't also concerned and also isn't working on it. But I feel like there needs to be a group of people who are working alongside the legislature and the City of Ithaca Common Council as we all try to figure this out. And it seems to me, and I think it's true for most of the people who sit on the subcommittee, that this board and its subcommittees are a good resource for whatever that group ends up being. It is true that the county is planning to have somebody on staff who will pay attention to this problem, and that might be a perfect opportunity for us to be involved in advising that person, but also hiring that person, and talking about what the scope of work for that person might be. And there was a final thought that I had that just went out of my head. But I think, here's one last thought. Conditions at the encampments have seemed to become much more difficult, and not only are people complaining about people at the encampment, but there's also complaints about people who live at the art house project on Cherry Street. So that whole area is becoming much more problematic than it has been in the past. Not that there was ever a good relationship. And what I'm concerned about is that the political pressure to do something is going to lead to problematic and enforcement of rules and responsibilities that are going to have a present difficulty for some of the people who live and stay in the encampment, most of whom, or a sizable minority of whom, are people that we concerned about. And not only are we concerned about, but the whole community-based mental health system was created to help support in the first place. So thanks.
Thanks, Larry. Maybe we'll turn to Frank. Can you give us a little summary of what's happening countywide regarding this issue, Frank?
Yeah, I think Jan and Larry covered most of it. The legislature did put in the budget a position that will be part of county administration that I believe is going to be called a homelessness coordinator. And I believe their charge is to work with community partners to bring solutions for consideration to the legislature. The legislature also put $100,000 in contingent fund for the potential support of projects related to homelessness, which Common Council, I believe, has now matched as well. So I think from a structural perspective, that's kind of where we are. It is my hope that the person that fills that new role will be looking for community partners to be part of the conversation. I don't know what that will look like or what form it'll take, but certainly we'll be advocating for that, that there be some kind of, group that supports that person in their work. As far as, the encampments, I'm going to try to give my thoughts on it. And like Jan, sometimes it's hard to keep opinion out of it. So I'll at least try to acknowledge it when it comes up. So I was asked by county administration to participate with the Tides group, as a county representative to kind of share, what the county knows and can do, and just, give them some insight on the county's, systems and how they work. And I'll tell you, the more that I participated with that group, the more that I came to support what they were talking about. And what I will say is that I looked at the Tides proposal as harm reduction. Right. It was an opportunity to alleviate some of the human suffering that's occurring in the encampments. It's not a solution to homelessness or even really the encampment issue. But until we find those solutions, it was an opportunity to, again, alleviate some of the human suffering that's occurring out there. I don't think anyone on the Tides group thought that if their project was funded, somehow all of the issues for homelessness or even the encampments would go away, but it was, a step in the right direction. It is often hard for government to embrace harm reduction over the history of harm reduction, right? So many times those projects do evolve from the private sector, community-based organizations, nonprofits that kind of get those things starting. Needle exchanges, as a public health example, the supervised injection facilities that were hyper controversial, kind of fall into that category as well. So with Tides being harm reduction, then it really falls to, the policy approach. And I know Veronica's there and the legislature's had a lot of conversations about this, but it really is my feeling that our policymakers, so the legislature and Common Council in this instance, they need to set policy on what they want to see happen related to homelessness and task us as department heads and their advisory boards and the community as a whole with finding solutions, to that policy approach. And I know that's difficult because if homelessness was easy to solve, we would have already solved it. And it is a big issue. No one thing is going to take care of the problem. And so there's a continuum. It is my belief, and here's where opinion comes in, that there's kind of two foundational things that need to occur from a first step perspective. One is we need low barrier shelter. Where we can get those that are able and willing to go into a low barrier shelter, into shelter and out of the encampments. And then we need to look at putting, I don't want to use the word enforcement, but we need to make sure that camping is not allowed on public lands once we have an alternative place for people to be. And when I say that, I don't mean going through and sweeping the encampments with law enforcement and kicking everyone out or throwing them in jail if they don't go. It's using a humane approach with our human service agencies. And I'll use the example of the dewatering site out in the encampments. A few years ago, I was involved with a task force on homelessness and encampments that was focused on the dewatering for the dredging of the flood control channel. And they needed the space cleared. And so there was conversations with the people living out there to say, hey, you can't stay here. So we need to get you somewhere else. And ultimately everyone moved. Now, some of them just moved further into the woods. Maybe some moved into shelter, outside of the encampments, but there are ways to work with the community out there. And it is a community, just as any other community exists, they do too. And so there are ways to do that. So for me, having a low barrier place for people to be that allows us to then look at not allowing camping on public lands that will force us as human service agencies, us, DSS, all of the agencies in the community that serve these populations to figure out where can folks go, right? How much is it going to cost? What services need to be available? And how do we really put a formal plan in place that we think is going to get us to where the encampments are limited? And then I would say, finally, there's always going to be those individuals that are out there that we don't have a solution for, right? That they're not going to go into any type of shelter we provide for them. But if we can make that number as small as possible, then we're able to work more directly one-on-one with those folks to try to figure out what it is they need and how we can get that to them where they are, right? If that's 5-10 people, that's manageable. If it's 100 people, there's no way that we can do it, to the level that is needed. So that's kind of my take on the encampments and where we are. The one thing that I want to mention is that I hope it's not a surprise to anyone that most of the people out there have a mental health, substance use, or perhaps developmental disability. We know that, right? Because we can't imagine that anyone living in the encampments is living their best life. Right, there are issues that they're facing, even just living out there. I think it was Larry that mentioned the stressors that come along with that. Even if you didn't have a diagnosis, if you're forced to live in that setting, there's no way that you can't be, needing additional supports to manage the stress associated with that. So there's a lot of work to be done. This conversation has happened several times. This is now the third task force or whatever you want to call it in the last 7 or 8 years that I participated on. And it really generally gets to the same place that we need to do something. We need our decision makers to tell us this is what we want you to do and task us with coming up with creative solutions to try to achieve it. I'm hopeful that the new position and the person that gets put in it, will help us bring those policy type decisions and solutions to our elected leaders, so we can get moving on this problem.
So just to ask Frank a question, what's the best way for those of us on this board to be involved in what the homeless person will be doing? And because I think since the majority of the people are impacted by the disabilities that we represent, or the disability areas that we represent, I think we should have major input into what the solutions will look like, and what resources should be brought to bear. So I think the question for all of us is, what's the best way for us to offer our expertise and our guidance to the county and specifically to this person? I think that's the question.
Yeah, and it's a really good question, and I'm not sure that I have an answer, specifically on what you should do. A good start and a continued start is continuing to educate yourselves about the experience of the people that live in the encampments. I will share that there's not consensus among the community outreach worker population about what should or shouldn't be done out there. That's one thing that I discovered, through this, the multiple times being on the task force, that even those of us in human services, you get us in the room, there's not a consensus on what should happen or what should be the first step. And so, I think I think continuing to understand from different, organizations that support folks in the encampment, they are willing. There are some of them that are willing to take you out there if that's something you're interested in seeing what it is firsthand. Because to Jan's point, if you go out there, it shocks you, right? We can talk about homelessness and encampments and that it's a bad place to be, but when you actually walk out there and see human beings living in the environment that they're in, it shocks you. And quite honestly, if it doesn't, we should talk, because it is really not a good place to be. And so just understanding that and knowing, that there are people out there, and then understanding that every one of them has a different story on what brought them to this point and what's going to change their path moving forward, and accepting that there isn't one solution that's going to help everyone. Those are big first steps from a personal understanding of the problem. At least it was for me. I think really how we formally get involved is this new position that's being formed. The legislature's made a commitment and said, look, we want a position where their sole purpose is to bring us information and potential opportunities around solving the homelessness issue. And so being involved with that person, and I think letting the legislature know that you want to be involved, and particularly that individual needs to hear from, community partners like yourselves, this board, the legislature's advisory boards, about your concerns and hopes for how this issue might be addressed in the county.
Frank, I'm not certain of the history here, but has there ever been, so I think a big part of the problem with approaches to dealing with people who are unhoused is that the solutions really need to come from those people, right? So we often try to apply, Band-Aids to problems that aren't well understood. And I think, I hear you saying this. I think it's true that wherever people congregate, societies form and relationships form. And so as much as we may observe, an encampment like that and view it as extremely dysfunctional, there will be people there who construct a reality around it, so that it is home. And so I think that's part of it is there's a lot of emotional entrenchment for, especially if people have been in unstable circumstances most of their lives, they may have actually found what they consider to be relative stability there. And there's that faction, but there's everything in between, right? And the only way to know is to understand. And I feel like it would be helpful to commission a study, because there are research methods, there are ways, of conducting research that involves the people that are the subjects of the research, so that you can segment the population. Then once you have the population segmented and you've gathered information from key informants, you can start to look at that data and say, all right, we've got, 50% of the folks who are saying they won't leave, no way, no how. We've got 25% of the folks who are saying, please, please, please get me out of here. And to begin to piece that together, I think then you have a data-informed approach to solving the problem. And you're right, it will never solve the problem, right? There will always be, a small number of people that remain unhoused for a variety of reasons. But I think that otherwise we're just guessing, right? We're throwing the spaghetti on the wall and we're seeing what sticks. And that is not usually an effective approach.
Yeah, I agree, Elise, that, talking to the people that are affected absolutely makes sense. I think one of the challenges, well, just to kind of put this on the table, is our encampment has a boom and a bust cycle because of the weather. Right. So what will start happening over the next several months, next couple of months, barring what's currently going on outside, it's going to get colder, and the number of people that stay out in the encampment shrinks over the winter time. And traditionally that number shrinks pretty dramatically, where it can be anywhere from, as little as 10 to 25 people that are actually navigating the coldest winter months out there, particularly in light of Code Blue, which allows, once the temperatures get under a certain degree, the county to put people up. We have to put people up, regardless of their status. So there is kind of this boom and bust cycle with the weather, and so who is out in the encampments tends to evolve. I think there's absolutely anything that we do should include the voices of the people that it's going to impact, and figuring out ways to gather those voices, I think, is something that we should talk with the new homeless coordinator about, connecting them with resources in our community that we're capable of doing that. And I know we have them. So I think that's part of it. And I think there's been conversations with folks out there through the community outreach workers. But honestly, the outreach workers have biases just like the rest of us. And so, they're interpreting what they heard from those individuals and figuring out a way to get as unbiased as possible a response from the folks that out there, I think would have significant value, and could certainly inform decision-making.
The one thing that occurs to me is that Cornell has their Engaged Cornell initiative, where there's actually the opportunity for to connect Cornell students to research projects and other things that connect to instruction at the university, and that have real world impact. So, it may be worthwhile, someone at the county, maybe the new person in that role, to reach out to Engage Cornell and see if there's anybody that wants to write a proposal for some of that funding with them. And get a class of, sociology grad students or something to design some research and go into the encampments and talk with people and gather data. And it would take months to design. So I think that lull in the population is the time when you want to be designing all of that. What's your next step? And then hit the ground running in the spring when everyone's going to come back.
Yeah, I agree. And I guess there's one elephant in the room that I want to put on the table too, is the law enforcement approach in the city of Ithaca at this point, or the lack thereof, or the inability due to whatever, barriers are in place to providing a more significant law enforcement approach, not around those that are homeless and making homelessness criminal. That's not what we're talking about, but the growth, the number of people that are out there. There are people that are preying on our traditional encampment residents, right? Because they can, and because there's nothing stopping them, whether it's law enforcement or a legal system or whatever it might be. And so, that's an issue that needs to be on the table and contemplated. Again, I'm not suggesting that we criminalize homelessness, but there are activities going on in the encampments that are criminal, and they are happening because it's essentially a place that nobody wants to go to make sure that those things don't happen. And that's a difficult conversation to have, particularly with the outreach workers, right? Because many of them are law enforcement doesn't need to even be in this conversation. And I think we're missing something if we're not at least considering that the environment itself is creating, is allowing criminal activity that is preying on the most vulnerable people that we have in our community that we're trying to protect. And so we have a responsibility to at least evaluate that part of it as well. And I know those will be difficult conversations, but they're conversations that need to be had.
I think for me, one huge issue, just to begin with, is housing in Tompkins County. We're in an absolute housing crisis in this county. There is not affordable housing. People who are currently housed, who are using, for instance, Section 8 or other subsidies, are not able to find housing, are losing their housing. There are so many people in this community. I've been in places where people are quote unquote housed, and they're living in garages, in sheds. This is not uncommon, to just live in an unheated shed behind someone's house. Those are the people who aren't making it to the encampment. And then we've heard how many beds? They're like maybe 2 beds. We've got 100 people we need to house in programs. There's maybe 2 beds. There are people who are never going to engage with programs. They still need housing. We're hearing when there's Code Blue, quite a few of those people go to hotels. I have a friend with substance use disorder right now who's fully engaged with the system, who's living in a hotel. She's in her 4th hotel in the last year now between Elmira and Ithaca. So I used to work with someone who moved here a couple months ago for, a job making $75,000 a year. He could not find housing, period. All the housing we're building is extraordinarily expensive. If I had to go into the housing market in Ithaca today, I would have a hard time affording housing. People with good paying jobs, with living wage paying jobs can't afford housing. So to me, the biggest issue is before we ask people to engage with services, where are we going to put them? We have to have housing in this county. It's been a crisis for years. It's getting worse. And, I think we're going to end up in a position where, potentially we're going to we are starting to price out the middle class here. The art house, the housing we've been building, these are great programs. Obviously, they're very complex. They deal with a lot of issues, but people who live in those, not just art house. I used to live at West Village. When I was a single mother, I illegally subletted an apartment at West Village because I couldn't get services and it was the only thing that I could afford. So, all of these, I think absolutely. But to me, the big focus we have to say, if we want to house people, is there has to be housing to put them in.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's the spectrum too, right? That's the challenge with this, is that we need high-end housing because there's not enough for the students. We need middle-class housing because there's not enough for that. We need low-income housing because there's not enough for that. We need housing with supportive services because we certainly don't have enough of that. So it's a long line across the continuum in order to meet this need. One thing I'd share, on that subject, and thank you for bringing it up, is, the art house situation, right? And a lot of the complaints that are coming out of there, it really proved the point that you can't just pluck folks out of homelessness, give them a place to stay, and expect on their own they're going to figure out how to navigate that successfully, right? When we're talking about, bringing people out of the encampment and housing them, we can't just give them a roof over their head. We need to give them a roof over their head, but there has to be more to it. There has to be services provided for them to help them, reintegrate, to deal with systems that they haven't dealt with before or haven't in a long time, or have a fear of, or an anger against, whatever it might be. So yeah, it is a big issue, and we absolutely have a housing crisis. And we're just talking about, the 100 or so folks in the encampment at this point, but there are a lot more folks not in the encampment that are not in stable housing, as you were just describing. And there's no doubt that that's the case. So it is a giant problem, and that's part of I think what stalls us so often is, where do you start with a problem that's significant? And, my suggestion, and I said this to the Tides folks, you started something, right? You started somewhere, whether it gets funded or not, you started a conversation and you brought something to the table. We need to just keep bringing things to the table until we can find, something that we can agree on that'll at least get us, started moving forward. But yeah, it's a big issue. There's no doubt.
And just to underscore the interconnectedness of all of it, we are, and we've invited the director of the Workforce Development Board in Tompkins County to the December Developmental Disability Subcommittee to talk about the workforce crisis in direct support services in Tompkins County, which is also putting people at risk of homelessness because they can't receive services because no one can staff those services. That loops right back around to the unaffordable housing. So people who work in those fields in the direct support role tend to make very low wages, and they literally cannot afford to live in Tompkins County. And for years, you would see people pushing out to more rural areas. And even those areas have become unaffordable for people. So I don't know what the solution is, but I think it has to involve workforce development. It has to involve the economic development people, because the next time we want to bring in another development company to build $3,000 a month studio apartments, because I'm dubious as to how many of those one community needs. We also need to talk to them about exchanging tax breaks for things like, supporting, for example, maybe a small SRO style, housing for people who are coming out of those types of encampments or other types of services. There has to be a give and take. I think a lot of people in the community feel like, for a very long time, it's only been take on the behalf of developers. And we see our community transforming, but not necessarily to the benefit of the most vulnerable. And to your point, we have recruited faculty in my institute who came and left within 2 years because they couldn't afford to buy a home here on their salary.
That's what happened with the deputy director for the county administrator
Yeah.
is that they accepted the offer and then rescinded her acceptance because they couldn't find housing at that level.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah,
We should,
I'm sorry. I just wanted to throw one more thing out there so we don't lose track of it is we haven't mentioned children at all, right? And so we know that we have children living in unstable housing in our community, couch surfing, whatever it might be. And that just creates huge vulnerabilities for them to things like, substance use disorders and human trafficking and the sex trade and all of those things that have, significant negative long-term impacts on our children and youth. And so, while we're talking about all of this, we can't lose sight of that there are some people that aren't even of age, to be able to make their own decisions legally, that we have to figure out how to serve and protect because they're part of this population too.
when is that survey supposed to come out about the couch surfing?
Yeah, it's a good question. Usually
results
it's
of it.
towards the end of the year, I think, but don't quote me on that. I can find out.
Other thoughts, questions? Larry?
Frank, do you or Veronica, do either of you know what the timeline for developing the position, the job description, and the recruitment will be? And because I think some buddies from us have to be involved in that, or at least have significant input to that. And the other thing is just to announce that Libby Barger from the Human Service Coalition, the Housing and Homeless Task Force, there is already a fairly efficient housing and homeless task force that Libby coordinates. She's coming to the mental health subcommittee on next Tuesday, because that will be the third Tuesday of the month. So not tomorrow, but the Tuesday after. So if people want to join either by, well, it'll be by Zoom. So if you want to join by Zoom, just let Karan know, and you can join us. So, I know partly I'm a bit of a control freak and want us to have fingers in everything, but it would be good to know what the timeline is for this and how we can most efficiently impact it.
Veronica, do you have any sense of that?
Frank might actually know better. So the budget, the position would be like the funding would begin at the beginning of January, assuming the budget gets approved, which we're voting on Tuesday.
Tomorrow.
Not tomorrow, the week after. And I can't remember what department that position is going to live in. Frank, do you?
Yeah, it's going to be in county admin. And usually what happens with new positions in the budget is work will begin right about now, because we pretty much know what the budget's going to look like, barring any changes next Tuesday, to kind of get those positions developed and in place so recruitment can begin to start as soon as possible in 2023. The reality of how quickly that actually happens, I'd imagine recruitment won't start till early 2023. But as far as developing the job description, I'm assuming county admin and the HR department will begin that, relatively soon. I think certainly influencing who the person is in the position probably has some value. But I think probably more importantly is influencing that person once they're in the position is probably where the most value comes from. I've worked for the county 12 years now. I think they generally are trying to find the best people they can that understand the issues in our county. And I have faith that, they'll find someone that, fits our values and wants to help solve the problem. Really what we've got to do is support and, influence that person once they're on board. So, certainly willing to pass along whatever message you want me to county admin. But I'd imagine there, in the next couple of weeks, we'll begin the process of developing a job description.
I wonder if one of our steps should be, as soon as somebody is hired, to invite them to a meeting so that they can hear from members what our concerns are, what our history has been with this issue. So I could imagine if things go along according to plan, maybe that would be February or March or something like that. We could take that step and start a connection and a relationship with that person.
I also think it's not too early to start, and maybe the subcommittees could actually start this, and the chairs could coordinate to sort of start to formulate things that without overwhelming the person, since we don't know what their basic job will be, and B, we don't know who the person will be. But it might make sense to start, thinking about things that we would recommend, and also resources that we think the person should be aware of, like Libby Barger and St. John's and Unity House, all the places that have a finger on. So maybe we should start doing some of that as well. So that we don't
chairs looking at that.
Yeah, so that we don't necessarily, hand them a 3-ring binder that says, here's the 900 things we think you need to work on, but a nice document that says, here are some key things that we think need to be addressed from a community services board perspective, or a health department perspective, even. Since we're a combined department. But we already, even though Elise is right that there needs to be consultation with people who are living there, we do also have some basic information and basic sense of what the problems are and where the gaps are. For instance, thank you, Frank, for bringing up children, because are we creating a group of people, or are a group of people being created who will simply, once they age out of the children's system, if they're connected to it, will they be homeless and living in the encampment or living in insecure places? So I recommend that the subcommittee chairs sort of get together and start putting something together.
I can say for the substance use subcommittee, I'm in contact with Oasis. They are looking at doing some more funding around housing. They're really starting to recognize how housing is so tied into substance use and mental health needs. So I think one of the great things about the developmental disabilities subcommittee is they regularly have somebody attend from OPWDD. So I'm working on getting somebody to attend our substance use one and to bring a housing expert, probably at the December meeting. And we also have DSS lined up for the mental health subcommittee for December as well, right, Larry? So
yes.
So I think we'll be able over the next few months in the subcommittees to get more and more information about it. So when this person is hired, we can share a lot of the information that we've, gleaned that may not be readily available to them, because they're not going to know, oh, Oasis might be providing some funding for programming, right? Or what's OMH doing about that? One of the challenges is how you can use Medicaid dollars. You can't use Medicaid dollars for housing, even though they recognize it as a big need. So figuring out how they're going to fund some of these programs will be important. I know that the housing people in Oasis also had some funding last year or this year that they were trying to actually give to some of their providers, and people wouldn't take it. So they did a survey to find out why the agencies didn't want it. And they said, because there's no
case management or additional supports. You're just putting people, like somebody said, you're just putting people in housing, but you're not giving them all the social supports and all the things they need wrapped around them. So if you don't do that, they're not going to be successful. So a lot of the providers actually didn't take this money that was on the table, but Oasis found that out and learned that. So I'm hoping that they're going to be looking at it a little bit differently this year.
So I would be,
We
I
should
would-
keep moving on. Larry, do you have,
I just say quickly, I'd be willing to chat with the other subcommittee chairs to see where we want to go with this. That's all I would say.
good. All right, so I just know we have to get into executive session and our time is running low, but
I move we go into executive session.
I second.
okay, let's do that. All right, so do we need to be?
Yeah, give me 1 second. I will end the